Well, we're looking at session number 5 today, and entitled Dinner in Bethany. And this is another event that took place before the actual triumphal entry. Remember, to this point, we've had Jesus crossing the Jordan into the old city grounds, remains that tell of old Jericho, passed into New Jericho. Going between the two, he ran into and healed 2 beggars, one named Bartimaeus. When he got inside of the new Jericho, he ran into Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus came down, was a changed man, and became a follower of Jesus. We assume, although we're not specifically told, that he did get back on the track. The 2 blind men, we're told, followed Jesus toward Jerusalem and the cross. But after they leave Jericho, then they move toward the descent into Jerusalem. But along the way, first comes Bethany, which is the home of Martha, Mary, and what was the guy's name he raised? Lazarus. Yeah. Anyhow, that's their home, and it turns out there was an event there before they moved on to Bethphage. I'll say it right one of these days. A second small town beyond Bethany toward the downside slope of the Mount of Olives, heading into Jerusalem, and then from Bethphage they would continue the triumphant entrance. They call it the triumphant, but wouldn't it be triumphal? I'm trying to think about what my grammar teacher would have told me. Anyhow, we call this dinner Bethany, with Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and probably a guy called Simon the leper. We find this in Luke 19, 1 through 9. Yeah, the first 9 verses of Luke 19. So Luke's given us the last 2 events. Yes, last time's event with Zacchaeus, now this meal. And the meal isn't central to the event. It's why the event was taking place, but the main feature was beyond the dinner. So, before we go down the slope to Jerusalem, before we start the parade on Mount Olive down towards the Passover and the Passion Week of Jesus, we're going to look at this event. Again, the event that took place where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, along with Simon the leper, apparently. Matthew 26:6. Now when Jesus was in Bethany, at the home of Simon the leper, so that's just to introduce this. Let's take a look at another well-known event and the timing marker that goes with it. We find that in John. And I'm looking here at John chapter 12. I'm going to read first just the 2 introductory verses. Jesus, therefore, and here's the timing marker, 6 days before the Passover. So Jesus is to go on the cross in 6 days. They came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, and that was not too far in the distant past. Couple, 3 months maybe, who knows. So they, including Simon, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, made him a supper there. Remember, he's on the road to Jerusalem. He's come through both Jerichos. And so they said, oh, come on, we'll fix a supper for you. Martha was serving, which was typical again. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with Jesus. So, cozy, simple dinner, right? Well, it was until this took place. Now I'm reading in verse 3. Mary, therefore, took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, also called spikenard sometimes, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. This is the second time we've seen something similar to this. The other one was much earlier in Jesus' time, his incarnation, his ministry time is quite a while ago, and the woman is not named there. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. This is not, as he said, if you go back to Luke 7, verses 36, 7, and 8, you will find this event described. Nard, and in that event, the woman used her tears to anoint Jesus' feet. Here, Mary uses an expensive perfume. It was called spikenard as well as nard. It was an aromatic perfume imported from the Himalayas. It was generally used on special occasions. And of course, this would have been Jesus' last stop off before entering Jerusalem, so it would be a special occasion. And now the statements about perfume, I've got a couple here, may surprise you. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 12. While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. And that wasn't for somebody's feet. Song of Solomon 4, verses 13 and 14. Your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, henna with nard plants, nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all the trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, along with all the finest spices. So I guarantee you those were special events. In some cases, this would have been Mary's retirement fund. Now, Mary evidently was unmarried, so when Lazarus would die, she would have no direct close male responsible for her well-being. So this nard that she had, which would turn out to be worth a full year's labor value, the value would be a full year's labor value, 300 300 denarii. Denarius, 300 times over. And it came in an alabaster jar, normally. Some say an alabaster box. And the only way to get it open, typically, was breaking the neck. It was no cork in it. So you had to break some part of the container, which would make the nard available for use at that point. But once it's open, there's no way to return it, or no easy method for saving anything you didn't use. So when Mary used this nard, this 300 denarii worth of nard, she was using it all. She was giving probably every ounce of value that she had to protect her in her old age. This was gone. She used it to anoint Jesus' feet. But because of that expense, though, Judas steps into action. And this time we're going to learn something about Judas that was never told before. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, one of the 12, who was intending to betray him, and that we've heard before. Almost every time the name Judas comes up, it's reminding us that he is the one who would betray Jesus into the hands of the religious leaders, who would then deliver him into the hands of the Romans. But Judas said this: why was this perfume not sold, not broken and spilled out? Why was it not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people? So Judas sounds very scriptural here, doesn't he? It sounds very spiritual. But he's going to betray Jesus soon, and this spiritual question, but what was it? It wasn't a spiritual question at all. John 12, verse 6. Now he said this, that's Judas. Judas said what he said about the money, the 300 denarii. Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor. Take any spiritual aspect of it away. But because he was a thief. This is the first time Judas is described as a thief. And as he had the money box, remember, he may have been the best educated of the bunch, so he probably was the treasurer of the group. He had the money box. He had access to any money that they had while on the road and moving and so forth. And finally it says, he used to pilfer what was put into it. So he was saying, this 300 denarii could have come into my cash box here, my money box, and they would have had access to those 300 denarii. So, again, first time we have heard about this side activity of Judas, of his nature, and I think that was the motive for the question. Again, it represented a working man's year's wage, a full year's wage, assuming he would work 300 out of 365 days. And he probably would, because there are 52 Sabbaths in there. So he could have been working at most just like 310 days a year. So this was fundamentally a year's income. But how did Jesus see it? Well, look at verse 7 of John 12. Therefore, Jesus therefore said, let her alone, in order that she may keep it for the day of my burial. I don't know, it just dawned on me. She may keep it, but she's already poured it out, but she probably didn't pour it all out. So she could keep what remains for Jesus' burial day. He was speaking, of course, of the Jewish custom of burying a dead person the same day as the death occurred, with grave clothes filled with perfumes and so forth, to combat the odor that would come over time. Remember, they were worried about Lazarus when he was called up and say, well, he will stink. Then Jesus spoke of the comparison of Mary's worship, its timing, and the question of alms for the poor. In verse 8 of John 12, Jesus says this, for the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. So what is he saying there? Look, you can give to the poor any day you want. They're always here. Not so with me. I got less than a week to live before being crucified. So John spoke what has been developed for most of Jesus' earthly ministry, the fact that the dinner was a main attraction now because of it. In verse 9 it says, the great multitude therefore of the Jews learned that he was there in Bethany, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also seize Lazarus, whom Jesus, raised from the dead. So Lazarus was now a person of interest, a person of some fame, and a person about whom was much curiosity. Now, but that wasn't good news to some. This was verse 9. Let's read verses 10 and 11 that follow. And this, remember, would have been prior to entering Jerusalem. But the chief priests took counsel that they might put Lazarus to death also. Remember, they had very early in Jesus' ministry decided they need a way to kill him. Now Lazarus is on the ticket too, because on account of him, Lazarus, many of the Jews were going away from Judaism, from the priests and so forth, and were believing in Jesus. I think Paul probably dealt with that also. The chief priests saw Lazarus as a co-conspirator with Jesus in leading people away from them and Judaism and to the person of Jesus as the Messiah. So these guys knew, if we can, we got to get rid of them. Excuse me a second. I'll hold up my Pepsi Cola with apologies to all you Coke fans, but it helps my throat sometimes. I don't know why I don't use it more. John 11, 45 to 52, a little bit longer session here. It says, many therefore of the Jews who had come to Mary, that's when Jesus returned to raise Lazarus, they're talking about while Mary was in that period, and beheld what Jesus had done, that is by raising Lazarus, believed in him. So some of those Jews believed in Jesus when he raised Lazarus. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees, the highly muckety-muck guys in the Judaism, convened a council, probably the Sanhedrin, and were saying, "What are we doing? For this man, Jesus, is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him." Well, we know today that's not true, but a whole lot will. Christianity is the largest organization of people in the world. And the Romans will come. Not only will we lose power with the people that go with Jesus, but the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So they were out looking out for their own welfare and also claiming to be looking out for Israel. But a certain one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, and if you remember Jesus' trials and so forth, Caiaphas was present there, said to them that the people who were at this meeting, "You know nothing at all." Nice way for a leader to begin, right? You're stupid. "Nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish." So what has he just said? If we knock off this one guy, everything will be well. Now this Caiaphas, did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation Israel, and not for the nation only, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And so there we are. This was all set up at a meeting shortly after Lazarus was raised, so it was some months ago, although there had been earlier attempts to set up a plan to get rid of Jesus. But here, this one was definitely set up, and the prophecy out of the mouth of the man who spoke much more better than he knew, because the very next day after this meeting, the very next day was to be Jesus' descent into Jerusalem, the triumphal entrance. And John 12, though, says, "On the next day, the great multitude who had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, joined with the locals and Jesus for the descent." So now we got a mixing of people and of motives. There were crowds of pilgrims headed for Jerusalem and the Passover feast. There were those interested in Jesus and Lazarus. There were the 12 of Jesus' closest comrades, and all present in the parade into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, which, if this was the 6th day that this event took place at the house of Simon the leper, then tomorrow The collection of the donkey and so forth would have been on day 5 before the Passover. So we've seen in the last several sessions, what is it? Well, Jesus and the 12 are crossed from Perea back into Israel. Jesus made his only recorded entrance into Jericho, probably both Jerichos, as I believe. He healed 2 blind beggars, at least one of whom seems to have been saved, but I think they were both saved. He called Zacchaeus out of a sycamore tree so that he could stay at Z's house. Apparently, Zacchaeus was saved too. He went to Bethany, where he was treated to a dinner at Simon the leper's, and a christening with perfume was made from Mary's stash of nard. We're told that Judas was a closet thief and that the crowd gathered to head down the path on Olivet. That crowd was a great crowd. It was growing as the descent into the city takes place on the 5th day before Passover. So, next time, on to the preparation for making that descent into Jerusalem and Jesus' Passion Week that will result in his death. So, we'll look forward